Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of Radical Thoughts on Innovation. I'm Maya Barber, and I'm here with my co host, John Hall. Over the coming weeks, we'll be diving into the often messy but always fascinating world of innovation. If you're into what holds big companies back, like siloed thinking or not thinking outside the box, this series is for you. Let's get started. John, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your reasoning for starting Spencer Hall?
Sure. So I started my career back in 1982 working for Procter& and Gamble. I was in brand management in the beauty care division. And during my tenure, I was part of the team that acquired Old Spice and started inject some fresh thinking into that brand and turn that around. And then the last couple of years that I was there, I ran our new ventures group for beauty care, created products like Olay Daily Facials. And that's where I really got the bug to focus on insights and innovation. So I started Spencer Hall in June of 96, almost 29 years ago. We're a consumer research and innovation consultancy, and we really focus in on understanding consumer needs and desires, what they're looking for, hoping for, and then developing solutions to address those. So it really allowed me to kind of tap into that curiosity to understand what motivates consumers and what drives their interest, and then coming up with inventive solutions for it.
Gotcha. So, has that always been an interest of yours then?
Yeah, I think for, now 40 plus years, that's something I've always been fascinated by is really just understanding what drives consumer behavior and again, how you can solve, problems or deliver on jobs to be done for them.
And I know I've heard you say the term DIY innovation can do you in. So can you speak a little bit about that and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say DIY innovation can do you in, what I mean is a lot of times there are client teams or project teams that don't have much budget. So they say, we're just going to do this ourselves. We're not going to bring in outside experts to help with idea generation. So they will, you know, get a conference room, bring in, about 10 or 12 folks that they know they can kind of get that would be willing to spend a couple days with them, ordering some pizzas, get the post-it notes out and, scritch ideas up around the room and then take some of those ideas, develop into concepts, put them into testing, and a few months later, they realized they didn't really have any big ideas. And so what happens is there's obviously an opportunity cost because they've not created the kind of big ideas they're hoping for. But then there's also the real cost of having spent money on developing and testing ideas and not having big ideas that come out of it. So in that sense, they did it themselves, DIY, but they didn't end up with the kind of big ideas they're hoping for. So they have to go back and try again.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know right now a lot of companies are falling into the trap of incremental thinking. So what can companies do to avoid that?
I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is expecting people to be creative on demand. Like I said, pulling them into the room for a couple of days and trying to pound the creativity out of them. And I think finding ways to let people be able to have a cadence and how they think about the creativity and to let them kind of tap into how they're the most creative selves. So um, what I would suggest doing is finding a way that people can start to think about ideas and generate ideas ahead of time. And this could be as simple as, setting up a Google Doc where you kind of lay out what we're trying to solve for and why, and then let people start to generate ideas, see other people's ideas, and kind of have that back and forth. And then have your in-person session where you now have all those other ideas that people have had a chance to think about and percolate, hang them up around the room and give people a chance now to kind of build from those and inspire fresh thinking. At Spencer Hall, we actually have a digital platform that allows for asynchronous idea generation that kind of follows this same model where we typically run a session over 3 days, but we ask participants just to spend an hour 3 times each day. So maybe an hour in the morning where they go onto the site and create and build ideas, middle of the day and at the end of the day. And what we found is that really does let them find a cadence that works best for them. So when they're on this site, they're looking at ideas, they might be looking at one of our creative exercises or some other stimuli, the creative juices are flowing. I mean, they're creating ideas, building ideas. So you really got that collaborative energy as if they're all together. But then that ability to log off, think, reflect, let your mind turn inward. I do some of my best thinking driving. So I might go for a drive. Others might go for a run. I have one expert that loves to have his tumbler of scotch on the deck, kind of let his mind wander. It just lets you tap into the way you're your most creative self. So I would say find ways to let people have that upfront ability to engage and disengage as a lead in to an actual in-person ideation session. I think that really would allow people to be able to be thinking more broadly and get beyond those incremental ideas.
I like that because I know a lot of companies will bring groups together for over a period of like 5 days for hours at a time, doing all this like big thinking. So, what is your opinion on that approach? And how do you think that goes against what Spencer Hall does?
I think there's always value when you get a team together where they can share ideas and that kind of thing. But again, some of the things we've already talked about that I think are limitations when that's your only approach to idea generation. Um, I think, in addition to some of the creativity being stifled, there's other factors at play. One of them is the conventional wisdom, where again, if you just got your project team there, there's a value that comes from that in-depth understanding they've got of their consumer and the company, the competition, and all that. But it also becomes somewhat self-limiting because they're seeing things through the same shared lens. So that gets in the way of creativity. There's also a challenge with groupthink where the loudest voices in the room can dominate. And that can be literally the loudest voices that kind of talk over other people, or figuratively, it's the senior voices in the room that, they put an idea out there and people can say, well, it's got to be a good idea because that person's important. They got to follow behind that person. That gets in the way of the true kind of creativity you're looking for. And then I just think, the personalities of people, you have some people that are introverted that aren't necessarily comfortable giving voice to their ideas in that kind of a forum, or other people that just want that time to think and reflect. So again, if they're having to come up with ideas on the spot, you may not be getting their best thinking either.
Yeah. And so, speaking of creativity, do you think it's possible to know too much to be creative?
That's interesting. I mean, I think it's a bit of an oxymoron, but I think there's some truth to that. And part of it goes back to what we talked about in terms of the conventional wisdom. And so what I would encourage is bringing in some fresh perspectives of people that can kind of challenge conventional thinking. Um, I'll give you an example of how this worked. We were doing a project for Fidelity several years ago that was working with their Fitzco division. This is the group that deals with 401k plans for nonprofits like hospitals and universities. And what they were finding was they had a lot of their employees who were eligible for these 401k matching programs that weren't participating, basically leaving money on the table. And these are smart people. I mean, these were doctors, nurses, university professors, that kind of a thing. And so they're trying to say, why are people not participating? So we were brought in to do some research for them and try to help provide insight into that. And as we talked to these folks, the thing that became very clear was the way enrollment was always done was it was, you got a stack of enrollment forms, you had to go through, fill them all out and that kind of a thing. And so these folks were, first of all, their lives were busy and they're like, I don't want to deal with that. But also just looks so daunting that like, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm put it in my drawer and let it go. As we're talking to consumers, one of them had actually mentioned, said, why could it be as easy as activating a credit card? Why can't I just, have a card, call a number and, answer a few questions and be enrolled? And we're like, that's kind of an interesting thought. Why can't it be that easy? So we went back to the clients. We kind of said, why can't it be? And they said, you know what? It really can because, we're partnering with these client companies. So we know salary progression, we know their corporate match levels and all that. We really could make it be that simple. So we created this idea of a fast start card that was able to be sent out to people instead of the stack of paperwork. I think it was within about 18 months, Fidelity had over $3 billion worth of new assets under management, just from that simple idea of saying, let's not do it the way it's always been done. Let's do it with a fast start card.
Yeah. It's like the smallest things can make the biggest difference. That's
Exactly.
crazy. So, if too much institutional knowledge can limit creativity, how can you leverage both those to get the best possible outcome?
I think you've got to hit on it. It's getting the best of both. It's saying I'm going to have my project team that has that in-depth understanding, but I'm going to marry that with some outsider thinking that can really help challenge convention, help challenge and push us. And so at Spencer Hall, we've actually curated a brain trust of I call them radical thinkers, but just inventive thinkers from a lot of different disciplines. They come from academia, the arts, entrepreneurship, technical development, that kind of a thing. And we'll bring a set of those that come into our ideation sessions and create ideas with our client teams. What I would suggest to companies that aren't necessarily wanting to hire Spencer Hall at this point is create your own brain trust. Find people that you can be, bringing in that will help challenge the team's in-depth understanding. So it could be, agency partners that you've got. It could be field salespeople. If you're on a brand and you've got friends that are in a different division or a different brand, maybe you bring them in. I think the key is to be very purposeful in identifying a set of divergent perspectives to help create ideas with your client team. So, if you had a marketing innovation session, don't bring in a bunch of marketers. Get people that are going to come at it from different angles because it really is that combination of divergent perspectives that is going to lead to the true breakthrough. So it is, don't lose that expertise to the client team and the project team, but marry it with outsiders that really can kind of challenge convention. I mean, the sparks of creativity fly in many directions. So really encourage bringing in those different perspectives.
And this is kind of off topic, but not really, because I guess the topic is innovation. But a few weeks ago, I was reading an article, and basically it was titled like "Innovation is a Buzzword." What is your opinion on that?
I don't know that I would say it's a buzzword as much as I would say it's overused. I think it's, it's a tendency, to be able to, try and say, hey, we're being innovative. We've got innovative marketing ideas. We've got this innovative new product. And I think sometimes what they're saying is innovation is really just incremental. And so I think the key is to be innovative, it really has to be making a meaningful advantage in delivering a product benefit, simplifying a process, bringing real meaningful value that help solve a need or a desire that the consumer has. So if you deliver that, if you've got that kind of meaningful advancement, it is innovative. If you don't, it is just a buzzword.
Another word I've been hearing going around is lean innovation. Can you explain what that means and your opinion on that as well?
Yeah, lean innovation, I think is there's a lot of elements of it I think are really good. This whole notion of, iteration, getting consumer feedback loops and kind of moving down the continuum, being able to pivot as needed when you find out, you need to strengthen elements for it. The thing that I really push for is really understanding, is it iteration or is it spinning your wheels? And by that, what I mean is I think it's so important to make sure you've got the strongest ideas at the outset. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, we'll fix these on the fly and as we move down the continuum. And what I would say is you've got to do a little bit more upfront to really make sure that you're starting with the strongest possible proposition. So I'm very much pushing the notion of really being consumer centric, really understanding deeply the consumer. What are they trying to get? What are they trying to solve for? What's the job to be done? But really understanding that in a very clear, disciplined way. The second thing then is saying, as we start to create solutions for that, let's make sure we are thinking as broadly as possible. So let's make sure we've got that set of divergent thinkers that are going to help create and build the ideas out together. So we're getting the strongest possible idea at the outset. And then the third thing I would say is make sure you do some quantitative testing up front of a host of ideas that come out of that initial idea generation. Don't just necessarily pick one on judgment and rally behind that, but do some quick quantitative testing, 2D kind of a thing at this point, a concept board with a visualization of your idea and a description of it, lets you then quantify and understand, is there consumer interest for this idea? What is the basis for that interest? If it's not strong enough right now, what do I need to do to make it stronger? So it really allows you to, before you start spending money and prototyping and all that, moving down the stage gate process, you've done everything up front to make sure you've got the strongest possible proposition that you're starting with.
And I know that right now a lot of companies are also falling into that trap of, not thinking outside the box, not, really willing to take risks. How can they change that to have a risk averse culture?
I think a lot of it really is a mindset shift. I mean, I think you really have to have this attitude that says we want to be pushing out. We want to have a culture that, rewards what I call bad ideas. And by that I mean if you aren't coming up with ideas that necessarily aren't, ready to go, it means you're not pushing out far enough. And so what I always say is there's no such thing as a bad idea. It could be an idea that the world's not ready for yet, or it's an idea that's going to trigger somebody to think of something they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's important to get that mindset that says we need to be pushing out. We need to be daring to challenge convention and be able to say, we're not going to do things the same way we've always done it. And I think the way to do that, there are a couple of things you can do. I mean, first of all, get that mindset. But then, you can do things like say, let's, as we're creating ideas, let's have one activity be designed specifically to create so-called bad ideas. And then you could actually spend some time saying, okay, if this is a bad idea, how do we invert it? How would we make it be, a great idea? And that just lets people see the value and the possibility in every idea. I think that is so important in getting beyond this risk averse culture that says, failure or a bad idea, is a problem. It's more, no, it's a stepping stone to great ideas. You've got to have that willingness to push out, to take some chances as you're creating ideas, or else you're not going to be coming up with the big ideas.
And looking at the time, we're getting close to time here, John, but if the viewers can take away one or two things, what would you like that to be?
I would say I think the key thing is really making sure you've done your due diligence up front. Really understanding what the consumer is looking for, the job to be done, what you're trying to solve for, and then, like I said, make sure that you are really widening the aperture for what you're looking for creating solutions to those ideas, bringing in those outsiders that are going to challenge convention, and really be getting an ideation exploratory that lets people really tap into their true source of creativity. That combination is going to be really important. Don't be insular. Don't just say it's just going to be this my project team. Really say I need to have a wider set of perspectives helping me generate those big ideas.
Gotcha. Well, thank you, John, for your time today. And thank you guys all for viewing. Stay tuned for the coming weeks. We'll have one of John's brain trust of radical thinkers on, who is a catalyst to change, who is speaking on his approach of innovation. Stay tuned, guys. Bye.